Where does the drop end? And where does the ocean begin? A drop of water is small, separate, distinct. The ocean is vast, seemingly endless. Surely there must be some point, some moment, where one becomes the other. But look closely, and you begin to realize there's no such line. The more you look, the harder it is to find. The border blurs. The line slips away. Is it when the drop touches the surface? When it dissolves? Or was it never separate to begin with? These are peculiar questions, uncomfortable ones, perhaps. Where do you end? And where does the world begin? Is the skin a boundary or a bridge? Are you a thing or a happening? What it means to be a drop that was never really apart from the sea, but if you were never apart, then who are you? And what is this I that you keep referring to? As if it were something solid, fixed, neatly wrapped in flesh and memory, we speak of my body, as though the body were an object, and my thoughts, as though the thinker stood somewhere behind them, pulling the strings. But search for that self, the one who owns, who controls, who decides, and it slips quietly through your fingers. You find sensations, you find images, memories, desires. But the owner, always just a little further back, like chasing your own shadow in the fog. And so perhaps the drop was never the question. Perhaps the question was always whether there ever was a you that stood apart to ask it. We imagine the ocean is out there and the drop is in here. But maybe what you are is not a drop at all, nor even a wave, but the entire movement of water itself, rippling, folding, rising for a time, and then falling back into stillness. Not lost, not gone, just no longer pretending to be separate. Now I'm sure that most of you know the old story about the astronaut who went far out into space and was asked on his return whether he had been to heaven and seen God, and he said yes. So they said to him, well, what about God? And he said, she is black. And although this is a very well-known and well-worn story, it is very profound, because what it's doing is shaking loose the image, the idea that God is a white-bearded man on a cloud sitting in judgment, watching you as if you were some kind of a naughty child. That God, the one you were probably taught in Sunday school, is a cultural relic, a projection of ancient patriarchy. The God who demands, punishes, rewards, that's not God. That's just a myth we've mistaken for the mystery. I knew a monk who began life as an atheist. Then he began reading Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, who spoke of élan vital, the vital force behind life. And the deeper he went into that philosophy, the more he realized they were talking about God, but without the robes and rituals. You see, I've read all kinds of theological arguments for the existence of God, and they often go like this. If you are intelligent and reasonable, you cannot be the product of a mechanical and meaningless universe. Figs do not grow on thistles. Grapes do not grow on thorns, and therefore you, as an aperture through which the universe observes itself, cannot be some mere fluke. This world peoples as a tree brings forth fruit, and the root of that tree, the ground of all being, must be intelligent. You see, The moment we begin to suspect there is intelligence at the root of the universe, something more than random flukes and blind chaos, we're tempted to leap to conclusion. We say, that must be the God of the Bible. And suddenly we're back with the old gentleman in the sky, robes flowing, eyes blazing, sitting upon a cosmic throne. But that, I would suggest, is rather like mistaking the menu for the meal, or confusing a finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. The trouble is not that this image exists, but that we've come to believe it is God, rather than a poetic attempt to describe what cannot be contained in any image. And of course, this God, this heavenly bureaucrat, comes with rules, expectations, keeps a great invisible record with your name on it. He rewards the good, punishes the bad, and watches everything like a celestial surveillance system. Now, that kind of God may have served a purpose once, like training wheels on a bicycle. But we've mistaken the training wheels for the ride itself. The reality, the true ground of being, is far subtler. It doesn't hand down commandments carved in stone. It whispers through the wind, hums in the silence between your thoughts, and reflects back at you every time you ask, who am I? And so, if you imagine God as something out there aloof and separate, perhaps it's time to look again. Because the God you're searching for may be the one doing the searching. Now, the curious thing about all of this is that the more seriously you begin to inquire, the more you find the boundaries between you and the universe begin to blur. You start to wonder, where precisely do you end and the rest of the world begin? Is it the skin? But the air flows in and out of your lungs. Is that not part of you? Is it the thoughts? But where do they come from? You see, we've all been taught quite convincingly that we are drops in the ocean, small, separate, fragile, at best lucky to be here, at worst meaningless specks floating in a cold, indifferent cosmos. But that, you must realize, is simply a metaphor, and a rather limited one at that. You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. In other words, what you call you is not a thing trapped inside a bag of skin. It is the universe playing, experimenting, exploring itself from a particular angle. Through your eyes it sees. Through your heart it feels. Through your hands it creates and destroys and rebuilds again. The idea that you are something other than the totality, a spectator in the stands, rather than a dancer in the performance, is the grand illusion, the cosmic joke. And the punchline is this: you were never separate. You were never alone. You are not looking at God. You are looking as God, just for a while, forgetting who you really are, so you could have the joy of remembering. Let's try something quite playful. If your image of God still resembles a patriarch with a white beard, floating somewhere above the clouds, with a booming voice and a list of moral infractions, perhaps it's time to invert the whole thing. Imagine instead God as a woman, and not just a woman, but a mother, and not just a mother, but a mystery, black, not white, silent, not shouting, not a radiant blaze, but a womb of infinite darkness from which all stars are born. You see, for far too long we've confused light with truth, and darkness with ignorance. But isn't it in the dark that seeds grow? Isn't it in silence that the soul begins to hear? So imagine God not enthroned above, but rooted deep below. Not a king dispensing laws, but the source from which Law and lawlessness both arise. And this isn't to say that God is female or male, or anything in between. That would be like assigning a gender to gravity. God is not a person at all, you see. God is the process behind person. The unfolding, the breathing in and out of existence. We get caught, terribly caught, in these images. Golden thrones, heavenly choirs, and someone keeping score. But images are only meant to point, not to imprison. So, if your God is always talking, maybe listen for the silence. If your God is always shining, try looking into the dark, because it may just be that the light you're chasing is only visible because of the darkness surrounding it. And it is from this fertile, unfathomable unknown that all things, including you, come forth. So, where does this leave us? If God is not a man in the sky, if God is not separate from the world, and not even separate from it, then what are we really looking for? It's rather like someone who's searching everywhere for their glasses, not realizing they're already wearing them, or a wave trying to find the ocean. You see, the more you search for God, as if he, she, or it were somewhere else, the more distant it will seem. Because the very act of seeking affirms the illusion that you are a part. But what if you stopped? Not in resignation, mind you, but in stillness. In that quiet moment, when there's nothing left to chase, something begins to stir. A soft knowing, not in the head, but in the marrow. A recognition, not of something found, but of something that was never missing. It turns out you were not the seeker, you were the sought. And the one doing the looking was always looking through your eyes. So what does all this mean practically? It means you don't have to go looking for God in the sky. You don't have to believe in fairy tales or pretend to be spiritual. You can simply start by talking, honestly, directly, like you would speak to a friend who actually listens. Because the truth is, it listens. It responds, not always with words, not always with the answer you thought you wanted, but with clarity, with timing, with quiet nudges you can't quite explain. Call it God. Call it the universe. Call it the intelligence behind all this. But once you start the conversation, genuinely, openly, you'll start to notice it was already happening. You've already been heard, and you've already been guided. The problem was never that it wasn't speaking. The problem is, we rarely stop long enough to listen. So try it. Not because you're supposed to, but because it's real. Speak plainly, honestly, and then be quiet long enough to notice what comes back. That's what prayer really is. And it's available any time you're willing to be sincere. Not just on Sundays, not just when life falls apart, but in ordinary moments when you remember you were never doing this alone.